Do you want to learn English in a fun and easy way? Stories help you understand words, sentences, and even emotions. Join me as we explore exciting stories and improve your English together. Listen, learn, and speak English naturally. Subscribe now and let's begin our English adventure.
The Journey of the United States, a story of growth, struggles, and hope. The United States of America is a land that has seen the rise and fall of empires, the clash of cultures, and the merging of ideas. It is a place where dreams and ambitions from every corner of the world converge, creating a nation that, for better or worse, has shaped the course of history. This is a story of how a group of colonies became the world's most influential superpower, of a land that was torn apart and healed again, and of a people who constantly redefine what it means to be free. Chapter 1: The Birth of a Nation. The story of the United States began in 1607 when a group of English settlers arrived in North America and established the first permanent colony in Jamestown, Virginia. Life was harsh in the early years. Many settlers struggled with hunger, disease, and conflicts with Native American tribes. But despite these hardships, more colonies began to form along the East Coast, growing into thriving communities with farms, businesses, and industries. For more than a century, these colonies were under British rule. At first, they accepted it, but over time, frustration grew. Britain passed new laws and taxes that the colonists had no say in, sparking anger and resentment. The phrase "no taxation without representation" became their rallying cry, spreading through cities like Boston and Philadelphia. People protested, and tensions between the colonies and Britain escalated. By 1775, the anger had turned into full-blown rebellion. On April 19th of that year, the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired at Lexington and Concord. The colonists, led by General George Washington, faced a difficult battle against the well-trained British Army. The war lasted for years, with many ups and downs, but in 1781, the American forces, with help from the French, secured a major victory at the Battle of Yorktown. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially recognizing the United States as an independent nation. But winning freedom was just the beginning. The young country needed a system of government to keep it united. In 1787, leaders gathered to create the U.S. Constitution, a set of laws that would shape the nation's future and ensure the rights of its people. With this, the foundation was set for a new democracy, built on the principles of freedom, equality, and self-rule. Chapter 2: The Growing Pains. The early years of the United States were full of challenges. The country was young, with only 13 states, but it was growing fast. Many settlers moved west, searching for land and new opportunities. But this expansion had consequences. Native American tribes had lived in these lands for centuries, and as settlers moved in, conflicts arose. Many indigenous people were forced to leave their homes, and diseases brought by Europeans devastated their communities. The economy was another big challenge. Leaders debated what kind of country the United States should become. Thomas Jefferson believed in an agricultural society, where farming was the backbone of the economy. Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, wanted an industrial nation, with factories and a strong banking system. At the same time, slavery remained a divisive issue. The southern states depended on enslaved labor for their plantations, while the northern states were beginning to move away from it. This disagreement created tension that would only grow in the coming years. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made a historic decision that changed the country's future. He bought a vast amount of land from France in what became known as the Louisiana Purchase. This doubled the size of the United States, opening new opportunities for settlement. To explore these lands, Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark on an expedition to map the territory, study its wildlife, and establish relations with Native American tribes. Their journey sparked excitement about westward expansion, and soon, thousands of settlers followed. But with expansion came more problems. The biggest question was whether slavery should be allowed in these new territories. As new states were added to the country, the North and South argued over this issue, creating deep divisions. Throughout the 1800s, these tensions grew stronger, making it clear that the United States was heading toward a major crisis, one that would eventually lead to war. Chapter 3: The Civil War and Reconstruction. By 1861, the United States was deeply divided over the issue of slavery. The election of Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the spread of slavery into new territories, was the final trigger for the crisis. Southern states feared that Lincoln's presidency would threaten their way of life, so they decided to secede, leave the Union, and form their own country, the Confederate States of America. This act of rebellion led to the start of the Civil War, a brutal conflict that lasted 4 years and claimed over 600,000 lives. The war was not just about keeping the country together, it was about the future of slavery. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that enslaved people in the Confederate States were now free. This gave the Union Army a moral purpose to fight, turning the war into a battle for freedom. After years of bloody battles, the Union Army finally won in 1865. The Civil War was over, and the country remained united. More importantly, slavery was officially abolished with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ensuring that no person could be enslaved in the United States ever again. However, the end of slavery did not mean true equality for African Americans. The period after the war, known as Reconstruction, was meant to rebuild the South and give freed slaves the same rights as white citizens. For a short time, African Americans were able to vote, own land, and even hold political office. But many white Southerners resisted these changes. They passed harsh laws called Jim Crow laws, which forced racial segregation and limited the rights of African Americans. Though the Civil War had ended slavery, the fight for racial equality was far from over. The struggles of African Americans during Reconstruction laid the foundation for the civil rights movement that would come nearly a century later. Chapter 4: Industrialization and the Rise of the American Dream. By the late 19th century, the United States had transformed into an industrial powerhouse. Railroads stretched across the country, connecting cities and making it easier to transport people and goods. Factories produced everything from steel to textiles, fueling economic growth and creating millions of jobs. America was no longer just a land of farmers, it was becoming a modern, industrial nation. Millions of immigrants arrived in search of a better life. They came from Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world, hoping to find jobs and opportunities. Many worked in factories, built railroads, or took on tough labor jobs. Their hard work helped shape the country's growing economy, but life was not easy. Factory jobs were often dangerous, paid very little, and required long hours. This period, known as the Gilded Age, was a time of both great wealth and deep poverty. A small group of industrialists, including men like Andrew Carnegie Steel and John D. Rockefeller Oil, became some of the richest people in history. Their businesses made them incredibly powerful, but their workers often struggled to make a living. As conditions worsened, labor unions formed to demand better wages, shorter hours, and safer working environments. Workers went on strike, sometimes leading to violent clashes with business owners and the government. Despite these hardships, a new idea took root in American culture: the American dream. People believed that anyone could achieve success through hard work and determination no matter where they came from. Stories of poor immigrants rising to wealth and success inspired millions, making the United States a symbol of opportunity and hope. Though life in the industrial era was difficult for many, it laid the foundation for the modern America we know today. The economy grew stronger, cities expanded, and the idea that people could create a better future for themselves became a defining part of the nation's identity. Chapter 5: The World Stage. As the United States grew into an industrial and economic powerhouse, it also began to play a bigger role in world affairs. By the early 20th century, America was no longer just a young nation, it had become a global force. One of the first signs of this change was the Spanish-American War in 1898. The war began after the sinking of the American battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor, which the U.S. blamed on Spain. The conflict lasted only a few months, but it had a big impact. The U.S. defeated Spain and took control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, marking the beginning of its overseas empire. World War I: America's role grows. At first, the United States tried to stay out of World War I, which began in Europe in 1914. But by 1917, events forced the U.S. to take action. Germany had been attacking American ships, and when a secret German message, the Zimmermann telegram, was discovered, encouraging Mexico to fight against the U.S., Americans were outraged. President Woodrow Wilson led the nation into the war, and American soldiers, known as the American Expeditionary Force, helped defeat Germany. After the war ended in 1918, the world looked to the U.S. for leadership. However, instead of taking a major role in world affairs, America chose to focus on itself. The 1920s became a period of economic growth, sometimes called the Roaring Twenties, as businesses boomed and new technologies like cars, radios, and movies changed everyday life. The Great Depression, a nation in crisis. But the prosperity didn't last. In 1929, the stock market crashed, sending the country into the Great Depression. Banks collapsed, businesses shut down, and millions of Americans lost their jobs. Many families struggled to afford food and basic necessities, and the once booming economy came to a standstill. To help the country recover, President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the New Deal in the 1930s. This was a series of government programs designed to create jobs, support struggling families, and rebuild the economy. Programs like Social Security were introduced to provide financial help to the elderly and unemployed. The government also funded public works projects, such as building roads, bridges, and schools, giving people jobs and improving the country's infrastructure. While the New Deal helped ease some of the economic struggles, the Great Depression wasn't truly ended until the outbreak of World War II, which would once again pull the United States onto the global stage. Chapter 6: World War and Beyond. World War II was one of the most significant events in American history. It changed the United States forever, both at home and on the world stage. America enters the war. At first, the United States tried to stay out of World War II, which began in 1939 when Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. But everything changed on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. The surprise attack killed thousands of Americans and destroyed many ships. The next day, the U.S. declared war on Japan, officially entering World War II. Soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S., and America was fully involved in the fight. The fight for victory. The U.S. played a major role in both Europe and the Pacific. American soldiers fought alongside Allied forces to push back Nazi Germany in Europe, while also battling Japanese forces in the Pacific. The war was long and difficult, but by 1945, the Allies had won. Nazi Germany surrendered in May, and after the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered in August, bringing World War II to an end. After the war, the United States became one of the world's two superpowers, along with the Soviet Union. But this victory led to a new conflict, the Cold War. The Cold War, a battle without fighting. The Cold War wasn't a direct war like World War II, but a long period of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both countries had powerful armies and nuclear weapons, and they competed to prove which system was better, American democracy and capitalism or Soviet communism. This rivalry played out in different ways. Proxy wars. Instead of fighting directly, the US and the Soviet Union supported opposite sides in wars around the world, like the Korean War 1950 to 1953 and the Vietnam War 1955 to 1975. The space race. Both countries tried to prove their technological superiority. In 1969, the U.S. won a major victory when astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the moon during the Apollo 11 mission. The Cold War shaped American life for decades, creating fears of nuclear war and influencing government policies. It finally came to an end in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. The fight for civil rights. While the Cold War dominated international affairs, big changes were happening inside the United States. Many Americans were fighting for their rights and equality. One of the most important movements was the Civil Rights Movement, which aimed to end racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X played key roles in pushing for change. Through protests, marches, and speeches, they demanded equal rights, especially the right to vote, go to school, and use public facilities without discrimination. This led to landmark victories, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned segregation and discrimination. Other social movements also gained momentum. Women's rights movement. Women fought for equal pay, job opportunities, and reproductive rights. LGBTQ+ rights movement. Activists demanded equal treatment for gay and transgender people, with events like the Stonewall riots of 1969 marking a turning point. Anti-war protests. Many Americans, especially young people, opposed the Vietnam War, leading to large protests in the 1960s and 1970s. By the end of the 20th century, America had changed dramatically. It was still a global superpower, but it had also become a country where more people had equal rights and opportunities than ever before. However, challenges remained, and the fight for justice and equality continued into the 21st century. Epilogue: A land of possibilities. The United States has always been a work in progress, a nation constantly growing, changing, and adapting. From the earliest days of the 13 colonies to its emergence as a global superpower, the country has faced wars, economic struggles, and social movements, yet it has always moved forward. At its heart, the United States is built on ideals of freedom, democracy, and opportunity. It is a place where people from different backgrounds, cultures, and beliefs come together to build something new. Immigrants from all over the world have arrived on its shores, each bringing their dreams, traditions, and contributions, helping to shape the nation's identity. Throughout history, the United States has overcome great challenges, from the fight for independence and the Civil War to the struggles for civil rights, equality, and justice. It has seen periods of prosperity and times of hardship, but through it all, the nation has remained resilient and determined. As the country moves forward into the future, it faces new challenges, technological advancements, climate change, political divisions, and social movements. But one thing remains unchanged: the American spirit of hope, ambition, and reinvention. The story of the United States is not yet complete. It continues to be written every day by the people who call it home. The journey goes on, and the dream of a better future lives on, carried forward by each new generation. Chapter 7: The Modern Era. As the 20th century came to a close and the 21st century began, the United States faced new challenges and opportunities. The country experienced economic growth, technological advancements, and global influence, but it also had to deal with terrorism, financial crisis, and political changes. The end of the Cold War and a new global role. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, officially ending the Cold War. Without its biggest rival, the United States became the world's only superpower. This meant the U.S. had more influence on global affairs, but it also had greater responsibility. The 1990s were a time of economic growth and technological progress. The Internet became widely available, changing the way people communicated, worked, and did business. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon helped shape the digital revolution, while new industries were born. The economy boomed, and many Americans enjoyed a higher standard of living. However, the new century brought unexpected challenges that would change America forever. The 9/11 attacks and the War on Terror. On September 11, 2001, terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes and carried out coordinated attacks on the United States. 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City, causing the Twin Towers to collapse. Another plane hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and the 4th crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back against the hijackers. The 9/11 attacks killed nearly 3,000 people, making it one of the deadliest days in U.S. history. Americans were in shock and mourning, and the government responded by launching the War on Terror. This included the war in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021, to remove the Taliban government that had supported Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, the terrorist group responsible for 9/11, the war in Iraq, 2003 to 2011. Based on claims that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which were never found. At home, the U.S. government increased security to prevent future attacks. Airports introduced stricter screenings, and the Patriot Act gave the government more power to monitor potential threats. The 2008 financial crisis and recovery. Just as the country was dealing with wars and security concerns, another major crisis hit, the financial crisis of 2008. This crisis was caused by problems in the housing market. Many banks gave out risky loans, and when homeowners couldn't pay them back, banks collapsed, businesses failed, and millions lost their jobs. The U.S. government stepped in with bailouts for banks and companies, while President Barack Obama, who was elected in 2008, introduced policies to help the economy recover. Over time, the country slowly rebounded, but many Americans struggled with job losses, foreclosures, and financial insecurity. A historic presidency, Barack Obama's election in 2008 was a historic moment. He became the first African American president of the United States, symbolizing progress in the country's long struggle for racial equality. His presidency focused on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, which aimed to make healthcare more accessible, ending the Iraq War and reducing U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, LGBTQ+ rights, including supporting same-sex marriage, which became legal in all 50 states in 2015. Obama's presidency inspired many Americans, but the country remained deeply divided over issues like healthcare, immigration, and racial justice. As the 21st century continued, the United States faced new challenges, including political divisions, climate change, and social movements fighting for equality and justice. The nation continued to evolve, proving that while history shaped its past, the future was still being written.
A new beginning in Canada. Once upon a time, there was a young woman named Maya, who had always dreamed of a fresh start. Born and raised in the crowded city of Mumbai, India, she had grown up surrounded by the noise of honking cars, bustling streets, and the constant rush of life. Every day felt like a race, with people hurrying to work, children darting through the crowds, and the clamor of street vendors selling their goods. Though it was vibrant and alive, deep inside Maya longed for a change, a new chapter, a place where she could find peace and explore a different pace of life. Maya had always been fascinated by Canada, the vast country known for its sprawling forests, stunning mountains, and diverse culture. The idea of living somewhere where nature played such a big role in daily life, where the people were friendly, and the pace of life was slower, seemed like a dream. After years of hard work, she decided to take the plunge. She applied for a permanent residency visa and, after months of waiting, received the life-changing news. She was approved. With a mix of excitement and anxiety, Maya packed her bags, said goodbye to her family, and boarded a plane bound for Canada. The long journey took her across continents, and as she gazed out the window, she felt a nervous excitement building inside her. She was about to begin a new chapter in her life. As the plane descended, and she saw the sprawling land of Canada below, she couldn't help but marvel at its vastness. There were no signs of the crowded streets and towering buildings she was used to, just wide-open spaces and endless stretches of land. As she wandered through the city, Maya couldn't help but feel both exhilarated and overwhelmed. Every corner she turned revealed something new: a cozy cafe with the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air, a bookstore with large windows showcasing shelves packed with novels, and a quiet park where people strolled with their dogs, bundled up in warm coats. Everything felt unfamiliar, yet there was a beauty in the unknown. She had expected the change to be drastic, but experiencing it firsthand was something else. The people here weren't unfriendly, but they were different. In Mumbai, strangers easily struck up conversations, neighbors knew each other's business, and the streets were alive with an unspoken sense of community. Here, people moved with quiet purpose, nodding politely as they passed, but rarely engaging in small talk. It made her feel invisible at times, like a tiny speck in a vast, sprawling city. Still, she was determined to make this place feel like home. She spent her first few days exploring, adjusting to the new rhythm of life. She marveled at the way the city blended urban life with nature, how glassy skyscrapers stood beside lush forests, how a short bus ride could take her from the city center to the edge of the Pacific Ocean where the waves crashed against the shore in a soothing, rhythmic dance. One morning, she found herself at Stanley Park, a massive green oasis in the heart of the city. The park's towering cedar and fir trees stood tall against the winter sky, their branches dusted with snow. As she walked along the seawall, the crisp air stinging her cheeks, She watched cyclists glide past and runners move with steady determination. The silence was different from Mumbai's chaos, but it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. It was still. For the first time since landing, Maya felt a flicker of something familiar, an unspoken connection between herself and the city. Maybe she didn't belong just yet, but she could see herself learning to. One of the first places Maya visited in Vancouver was Stanley Park, a massive green oasis right in the heart of the city. The moment she stepped inside, she felt like she had entered another world. The towering trees stretched high above her, their branches dusted with snow, and the crisp scent of pine filled the air. It was quiet, so different from the constant honking and bustling crowds of Mumbai. As she walked along the seawall, she took in the breathtaking views. On one side, the vast ocean stretched endlessly, its waves gently lapping against the rocky shore. On the other, snow-capped mountains stood tall in the distance, their peaks glowing under the winter sun. She had never seen anything like this before. The combination of water, mountains, and forest all in one place felt almost magical. For the first time since arriving, she felt truly at peace. There were no rushing crowds, no overwhelming noise, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and the occasional call of a seagull soaring above. It was a stark contrast to the life she had left behind, but it was a welcome change. As she continued to explore Vancouver, Maya started noticing small things that made this place different from India. People walked at a slower pace, taking their time instead of rushing from one place to another. They valued personal space, keeping a respectful distance even in crowded areas. Strangers smiled politely but didn't always strike up conversations the way people did back home. At first, it felt strange, almost lonely, but she soon realized it was just a different way of living. One thing that amazed her was how multicultural the city was. Everywhere she went, she saw people from different backgrounds: Indians, Chinese, Italians, Persians, and so many more, each bringing their own culture, traditions, and stories. The local markets reflected this beautiful diversity. She visited shops selling Indian spices that reminded her of home, Chinese bakeries with delicious pastries, and Italian cafes with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. It was comforting to see pieces of the world she knew mixed into this new city. Slowly, Maya began to feel less like an outsider and more like a part of something bigger. Vancouver was different from Mumbai, but in its own way. It was just as full of life, just a quieter, calmer kind of life. At first, Maya found herself struggling with loneliness. The excitement of starting a new life was overshadowed by feelings of homesickness, especially in the evenings, when the days grew shorter and the streets were quiet. She missed her family, their voices, their laughter, and the familiar comfort of her old life. Calling her parents back home brought her both joy and sadness. They would share stories about their lives, and she would tell them about her new experiences in Canada. The conversations were comforting, but they couldn't fully close the distance between her old world and the new one she was trying to build. One thing that took Maya completely by surprise was the winter. She had never seen snow before, and when the first snowflakes started to fall, it felt like something out of a dream. She watched from her apartment window as the city transformed into a winter wonderland. The soft snowflakes glistened as they fell, covering everything in a thick, white blanket. Maya felt a sense of awe and wonder as she watched the snow fall gently from the sky. She quickly put on her warmest coat, wrapped herself in scarves and mittens, and stepped outside into the cold. Surprisingly, the chill didn't feel as harsh as she had imagined. In fact, there was something soothing about it: the quiet stillness of the snow-covered streets, the crisp air, and the feeling of being surrounded by such peaceful beauty. Winter brought with it new adventures. Maya found herself going on skiing trips to the mountains, enjoying snowball fights with new friends, and spending cozy nights by the fireplace, sipping hot chocolate. What had once seemed like a challenge and experience she wasn't sure she could handle became something she looked forward to. The cold, the snow, and the changes in the seasons were now a part of her new life, and Maya was learning to love them. But not every day was easy. There were moments when doubt crept in, and Maya questioned whether she had made the right choice. The initial excitement of a new beginning slowly wore off, and the reality of adjusting to life in a different country hit her. She missed the vibrancy of Mumbai, the crowded markets, the spicy street food, the lively festivals, and the constant hum of activity. Sometimes, the quiet of Vancouver felt overwhelming, and she found herself feeling isolated. The absence of the noise and chaos she was used to left a void, and there were days when she wondered if she would ever fully feel at home. One evening, when Maya was feeling particularly homesick, she decided to attend a local community event for newcomers. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she hoped it would help her feel less alone. As she entered the cozy event space, she saw people from all walks of life, some chatting excitedly, others sipping warm drinks, all gathered with a shared purpose: to find connection in a foreign land. It was there that she met a group of fellow immigrants who, like her, were adjusting to life in Canada. They sat together at a small table in a nearby coffee shop after the event, their conversations flowing easily as they shared their experiences. One of them, Amal, was from Syria and spoke of her homeland's rich culture and traditions. Another, Daniel, had come from Ethiopia and missed the bustling street markets filled with the scent of coffee and spices. Maria, from the Philippines, laughed as she described the challenge of adapting to Canada's unpredictable weather. As they swapped stories, Maya realized that despite their different backgrounds, they all shared similar struggles: the uncertainty of starting over, the longing for home, and the small victories that made the journey worthwhile. They laughed at their early mistakes, like mispronouncing street names or struggling with the self-checkout machines at grocery stores. For the first time in a while, Maya felt understood. That evening marked a turning point for her. She no longer felt like she was navigating this new life alone. She had found a small but supportive community, people who knew what it was like to feel out of place but were also determined to make Canada their home. As the weeks went by, Maya slowly started to settle into her new life. She found a job in an office that allowed her to use her skills while also giving her space to explore her creative passions. It wasn't always easy, but she enjoyed the challenge of learning new things. Her confidence grew with each passing day. She also began to embrace the simple joys of her new home. She loved quiet evenings spent reading by the fireplace, something she never had time for in Mumbai's fast-paced life. She discovered a small bakery near her apartment that made the most delicious pastries, and she made it a habit to stop by every Sunday morning. She spent weekends exploring the breathtaking landscapes just outside the city, hiking through lush green forests in the summer, watching the autumn leaves paint the streets in shades of gold and red, and marveling at the way the winter snow transformed everything into a wonderland. Bit by bit, Maya's life in Canada began to feel less like an unfamiliar chapter and more like a story she was writing for herself. The ache of homesickness never fully disappeared, but it became a softer, more manageable feeling, one that reminded her of where she came from while allowing her to embrace where she was going. As the years went by, Maya no longer felt like an outsider in Canada. What once seemed unfamiliar had become second nature. The streets she had once hesitated to walk now felt like home. She no longer struggled through the harsh winters. Instead, she embraced them, layering up with ease, sipping hot chocolate on snowy evenings, and even looking forward to winter activities she once found intimidating. Her friendships deepened. Her colleagues became more than just coworkers. They became a second family. She got to know her neighbors, sharing meals and exchanging small acts of kindness. She felt a sense of belonging in the community, whether it was through volunteering at local festivals, attending cultural events, or simply enjoying a quiet morning at her favorite cafe. Each passing day, she became more involved in the world around her, feeling not just like a guest but like someone who truly belonged. Maya never stopped loving India. She still missed the familiar smells of street food, the vibrant festivals, and the constant energy of Mumbai. But she realized that home wasn't just about a place, it was about feeling at peace, feeling connected. Canada had given her room to grow, to experience new things, and to build a life that felt whole. And so, Maya's journey continued, filled with both challenges and joys. She had learned that life wasn't just about where you came from, or where you were headed. It was about the people you met, the memories you created, and the courage to step into the unknown. In finding her place in Canada, she had also found herself.
Charlie's silent struggle. Charlie sat in the back corner of his classroom, gripping his pencil so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded every time the teacher's eyes scanned the room, searching for someone to call on. He kept his head down, pretending to write, hoping, praying that she wouldn't say his name. He wasn't always this quiet. Back home in Vietnam, he had been an outgoing, talkative kid. He loved telling jokes, sharing stories with his friends, and answering questions in class without hesitation. But here in America, everything was different. The moment he stepped into his new school, he felt small, lost in a sea of unfamiliar faces, and words he couldn't understand. Conversations buzzed around him, but they were too fast, too confusing. English wasn't just a subject to learn, it was a barrier, a wall separating him from the world. It wasn't just the language itself that held him back, but the way it made him feel invisible. His classmates laughed at jokes he didn't get, participated in discussions he couldn't follow, and exchanged stories he could only imagine. Every conversation felt like a door closing in his face, and the harder he tried to open it, the more it felt like he was being shut out. At first, he tried to push through the discomfort. He practiced speaking English with his parents at home, repeating phrases in front of the mirror until his tongue grew tired. But even in the quiet of his own room, the words felt foreign on his lips. There was always something missing, a connection he couldn't find. In class, the teacher's voice seemed to grow louder with each passing day. She asked him questions he didn't know how to answer. Her eyes lingered on him, as if she expected him to speak up. But every time she looked his way, Charlie would freeze, his mind going blank. He wanted to raise his hand, wanted to show that he was learning, but the fear of making a mistake, the fear of not being understood held him back. So, he kept his head down, kept writing, kept hoping. The classroom, once full of possibilities, now felt like a maze of words and expectations. Every time the teacher called on someone else, Charlie couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. How easy it seemed for them to speak, to express themselves with confidence. He wanted that. He wanted to be able to laugh and joke with the others, to have conversations without the constant dread of getting something wrong. One afternoon, as the bell rang and students filed out of the classroom, Charlie stayed behind, staring at the homework assignment on his desk. His classmates were already talking to each other in the hallway, but Charlie couldn't bring himself to join them. He wasn't sure what to say. Even when they smiled at him, he smiled back, but it felt empty. He was there, physically present, but mentally somewhere far away. As he gathered his things, the teacher, Ms. Ramirez, walked over to him. She had a kind smile, but Charlie had seen it before, a smile that seemed to pity him, as though she knew how hard it was for him to fit in. "Charlie," she said softly, "I know it's tough right now, but I want you to know, I believe in you. You don't have to be perfect. Just take it one step at a time." Charlie nodded, but the words didn't seem to reach him. How could he take it one step at a time when every step felt like a mountain? How could he believe in himself when the world around him seemed so much bigger than he was? That night, as Charlie sat at the kitchen table with his homework, his mother came in and sat beside him. She didn't speak at first, just looked at the page in front of him. Then gently, she placed her hand on his. "Charlie," she said, "I know this is hard, but I want you to remember something: this isn't forever. You're strong, you're learning, and one day, this will all be easy." Charlie looked up at his mother, her face lined with worry but full of love. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that things would get better. But in that moment, the weight of it all felt too heavy to carry. Still, he squeezed her hand and nodded. For her, he would try. He would keep going, even when the language felt like a wall he couldn't scale. The next day, as he entered the classroom, he took a deep breath and forced himself to sit up a little straighter. His pencil wasn't so tight in his hand anymore. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but he was learning. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The fear of speaking. Charlie understood some English when he read it, and he could write simple sentences, but speaking, that was the hardest part. Words felt heavy on his tongue. Every time he tried to say something, he worried about mispronouncing a word or using the wrong grammar. It wasn't just about making mistakes, it was about the fear that people would see him as different, or worse, that they wouldn't understand him at all. When Charlie spoke in his native language back home, the words flowed easily. The rhythm of Vietnamese was familiar, comforting, like a song he'd known all his life. But English was a foreign melody, jarring, uncertain, and unpredictable. His tongue stumbled over sounds that didn't exist in his own language, and he felt like an actor fumbling through a script he didn't fully understand. His classmates spoke so quickly that their words blurred together, creating a constant hum in the background. They laughed, they joked, and Charlie could barely keep up. When they laughed, he wondered if they were laughing at him. Were they laughing at his accent? Were they noticing how slowly he spoke, how unsure he sounded? His mind raced with questions, and each one tightened the knot in his stomach. When they whispered, he feared they were whispering about how strange he sounded, or worse, about how out of place he was. There was a moment, one that haunted him more than any other, when he overheard a classmate, Mark, he thought, saying something about him. "He doesn't even know how to speak English properly," Mark had said, laughing with his friends. Charlie had frozen. The words had cut through him like a knife, though they had been said in passing, without any malice, just an observation. But to Charlie, it felt like the entire world had paused to highlight his failure. He tried to push the memory away, but it clung to him, growing larger in his mind with each passing day. So, he stayed quiet. He avoided raising his hand in class. Even when he knew the answer, he nodded instead of speaking. He let others talk while he remained silent, afraid of making a mistake. In group discussions, Charlie would find a quiet corner of the room, taking refuge behind the papers in front of him. He'd listen, really listen, trying to understand every word, every sentence, but when it was his turn to speak, his mind would go blank. His throat would tighten, his chest would constrict, and the words he thought he knew would disappear like smoke. He watched his classmates, admiring how effortlessly they conversed. They spoke without thinking, without fear. Sometimes, he would catch their eye, but quickly look away, too embarrassed to let them see his struggle. How could they understand? They'd never known what it felt like to be trapped in a language that wasn't their own, to feel the constant pressure of trying to communicate, of trying to fit in when every word seemed to pull him farther from that goal. Even at lunch, when the atmosphere was more relaxed, and the conversations lighter, Charlie could hardly bring himself to join in. The table around him was alive with chatter and laughter, but Charlie sat there, pushing food around on his plate, not daring to speak. He wanted to laugh along, wanted to join in the jokes, but how could he, when he was so unsure of his own voice? It was easier to be invisible, to just blend into the background where no one expected him to contribute. No one could laugh at what he didn't say. He wondered if anyone even noticed. Did they care? Were they even aware of how his silence grew each day? How the fear in his chest tightened with each passing conversation he couldn't join? Sometimes he imagined his classmates wouldn't even miss him if he wasn't there at all. They seemed so comfortable with each other, their friendships effortless. He wanted that too, but the words wouldn't come. One afternoon, however, something happened that broke his pattern. Ms. Ramirez, his teacher, had just finished explaining a math problem on the board, and as usual, Charlie stayed silent, his pencil poised above his notebook. But then, without thinking, she called on him. "Charlie," she said gently, "can you explain how you solved this problem?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Charlie's heart raced. His mouth went dry. His eyes darted to the board, to the numbers, but none of it seemed to make sense. It felt like all eyes were on him, waiting, expecting. His face flushed hot, and for a moment, he couldn't remember the problem. But then something inside him shifted. A flicker of resolve, no matter how small, sparked in his chest. He opened his mouth, but the words felt stuck. He began, but then stopped, breath caught in his throat. Ms. Ramirez smiled kindly, not rushing him. "Take your time, Charlie. We're here to help you." The class, to his surprise, didn't laugh or whisper. They waited. They listened. And in that moment, Charlie realized that no one was judging him, not really. They were just waiting for him to find his way, just as he was still trying to find his place. Taking a deep breath, he tried again. "Roman, I think you have to multiply first," he stammered, the words rough but clear. Then add. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't eloquent, but for the first time in a long while, it was enough. The class nodded, a few even offering smiles of encouragement. Charlie's hands were shaking, but he didn't care. He had spoken. He had found his voice. The next day, Charlie didn't feel so afraid. He still wasn't confident, still didn't know if he'd ever speak as easily as the others, but he wasn't invisible anymore. Each time he opened his mouth, even if the words came out slowly or imperfectly, it was one small step closer to breaking down the wall that had kept him silent for so long. Maybe, just maybe, speaking didn't have to be so scary after all. The group project? One day, during English class, Charlie's teacher, Mrs. Thompson, smiled at the class. For the next 2 weeks, you'll be working on a group project, she announced, her eyes scanning the room as the students perked up. Each group will create a short presentation about a famous historical figure. Charlie's stomach twisted. A presentation. That meant speaking in front of the whole class. His heart thudded in his chest, and his palms grew clammy. He could feel the weight of the assignment pressing down on him. The thought of standing in front of everyone and speaking English, his second language, filled him with dread. The teacher divided the students into groups, and Charlie was paired with 3 classmates, Liam, Emily, and Jacob. They were friendly enough, but to Charlie, they might as well have been strangers. Even though they'd spoken to him in class before, he still felt like an outsider. There was a part of him that wanted to be included, wanted to join in, but speaking up, that felt impossible. During their first group meeting, they gathered around a table in the library. The room was quiet, save for the rustling of papers and the soft hum of the air conditioning. Charlie sat at the edge of the table, feeling the familiar knot in his stomach tighten as his group began brainstorming ideas. Let's do Martin Luther King Jr., Liam suggested, his voice confident. His I Have a Dream speech is famous. We can really dive into his impact on the civil rights movement. Everyone agreed, except Charlie, who simply nodded in agreement. He didn't know enough about Martin Luther King Jr. to argue, but more than that, he didn't feel comfortable speaking up. As the others began discussing their parts, Charlie's mind wandered, his thoughts consumed by the overwhelming fear of presenting. Okay, we'll split up the work, Emily said, her voice cheerful as she pulled out her notebook. I'll research his early life. Jacob, you can do his speeches. Liam, you can cover his impact. She turned to Charlie with a bright smile. And Charlie, you can talk about his legacy. Charlie's heart started racing. Maybe I can. Write notes instead, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Emily tilted her head, her expression confused but kind. But we all have to present, Charlie. We're all part of this. Charlie's throat tightened. He wanted to help, but standing in front of the class, speaking in English, the thought terrified him. His mind raced as he looked around at his classmates, who seemed to speak with such ease, such confidence. How could he ever do that? I can help with the research though. I'll do my part, Charlie said, trying to avoid the uncomfortable silence that filled the space between his words. Liam gave him an encouraging smile. No worries, man. We're all in this together. It'll be fun. But Charlie didn't feel fun. He felt trapped. The thought of presenting his part to the class made his stomach churn. He was already thinking ahead to the moment when he would have to speak, when he would stumble over his words, or mispronounce something. The idea of the whole class staring at him while he struggled to find the right words made him want to disappear. A talk with Mrs. Thompson. After class, Charlie lingered behind, watching as his classmates gathered their things and rushed out of the room. He stayed in his seat for a moment, unsure of what to do next. His heart was still pounding from the anxiety of the group project, and his mind swirled with doubts and fears. Finally, after taking a deep breath, he stood up and walked slowly to Mrs. Thompson's desk. He hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't do the presentation. Mrs. Thompson looked up from her papers, her expression warm and understanding. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze soft but firm. Why not, Charlie? Charlie shifted nervously, staring down at his shoes. He kicked at a small pebble under his foot, feeling the weight of his words catch in his throat. I don't speak good English, he finally said, his voice cracking slightly. There was a long pause before Mrs. Thompson spoke again. Her voice was gentle, but there was an edge of detonation. Charlie, your English is better than you think, and the only way to improve is to practice. I know it's scary, but I believe in you. Charlie swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it even harder to speak. He couldn't meet her eyes. He wasn't sure if he believed in himself. He'd heard people say things like that before, his parents, the teachers, even the other students, but the words always felt hollow to him. They didn't understand how hard it was. They didn't know what it felt like to be constantly fighting against a language that wasn't your own. I can't stand in front of everyone, Charlie muttered, more to himself than to Mrs. Thompson. What if they laugh? What if I say something wrong? Mrs. Thompson stood up, walking over to Charlie, and gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Charlie, everyone makes mistakes. But that doesn't make you any less valuable or important. I know it's difficult, but you are more than capable. This project is about working together, learning together. It's okay to be scared. What matters is that you try. Charlie's eyes remained fixed on the floor, his heart still racing, But there was a small, flickering spark of something deep inside him. Could he really do this? Could he face his fear, take a deep breath, and speak in front of the class? I don't know if I can, Charlie whispered. Mrs. Thompson smiled softly, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. You don't have to do it alone. We'll all be here to support you, and I'll help you with anything you need. Just take it one step at a time? Charlie nodded, the words sinking in slowly. He wasn't sure if he believed in himself just yet, but maybe, just maybe, with a little help, he could try. As Charlie left the classroom, he felt a strange mix of fear and hope swirling inside him. He still wasn't sure how he would get through the presentation, but for the first time, he felt like there might be a way. Maybe Mrs. Thompson was right? Maybe the only way to overcome his fear was to face it, even if it was one shaky step at a time. Practice makes progress. At home, Charlie tried to practice, but it wasn't easy. He stood in front of the mirror, clutching his notes tightly in his hands, his heart racing as he rehearsed his part of the speech. He mouthed the words softly, feeling them hang in the air like strangers. They sounded stiff, unnatural, foreign in his mouth. He would pause after every sentence, mentally replaying his mistakes, worried that he'd forget everything when the time came. He could already imagine it standing in front of the class, blanking out, hearing the stifled giggles or murmurs as he struggled. His throat would tighten, his palms would sweat, and the shame would be unbearable. He couldn't let that happen. He had to get this right. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table, staring at his notes in defeat, his little sister, Lynn, walked over. Her tiny feet patted against the floor, and she glanced up at him with her big, innocent eyes. What are you doing? She asked in Vietnamese, her head tilting slightly as she stared at him curiously. Charlie sighed, and glanced down at his notes. Practicing for a presentation, he replied, trying to make his voice sound nonchalant, though his nerves were evident. Lynn didn't say anything right away but instead walked over to him, her eyes scanning his notes with interest. Can I hear it? Charlie hesitated, unsure. The thought of speaking in front of anyone, let alone his little sister, made him uneasy. But Lynn wasn't like the kids at school. She wouldn't laugh at him or judge him. She was his little sister, someone who loved him no matter what. And something about her gaze so full of trust and curiosity made him feel like it was worth a shot. He cleared his throat, and with a nervous breath, began reading his part. His voice wavered at first, trembling with uncertainty, his pronunciation stumbling over the difficult words. It didn't sound smooth like the others. It felt raw, unfinished, and far from perfect. But he didn't stop. When he finished, he glanced at Lynn, bracing himself for the critical look he expected. He couldn't help but feel embarrassed. But Lynn just grinned, her eyes sparkling with excitement. You sounded good, she said, her voice full of encouragement. Charlie raised an eyebrow, unsure if he'd heard her right. Really? She nodded enthusiastically, then squinted at him playfully. You just need to be louder? You sound scared. Charlie chuckled softly, relief flooding through him. He'd expected her to be kinder, but her honesty was exactly what he needed. He smiled at her, a little more confident than before. Thanks, Lynn. That night, after she had gone to bed, Charlie went back to practicing. He stood in front of the mirror once more, this time speaking a little louder. He focused on pushing past the fear in his chest, letting his voice carry just a bit more. Each word still felt difficult, but he tried to remember Lynn's words. Be louder. Don't sound scared. Slowly, he began to speak with a little more conviction, even if his hands still shook. Facing his fears, the day of the presentation arrived faster than Charlie was ready for. His stomach was a mess of knots, and his palms were clammy as he clutched his notes tightly, almost crumpling the paper in his grip. His group gathered at the front of the classroom, ready to present. One by one, Liam, Emily, and Jacob took turns, speaking confidently about Martin Luther King Jr.'s early life, speeches, and the impact he had on the civil rights movement. Then, it was Charlie's turn. His heart hammered in his chest, his head spinning. The room felt so much bigger than it had moments before. He glanced at his classmates, all of whom were staring at him with varying degrees of interest, but his mind barely registered their faces. It was Mrs. Thompson's smile, the encouraging nod, that grounded him. Her look of calm reassurance told him he wasn't alone in this. Taking a deep breath, Charlie took a step forward. The air in the classroom felt thick, like he was standing in the middle of a storm. His hands were shaking as he held his notes in front of him. His mouth felt dry. His heartbeat roared in his ears, making everything feel distant and muffled. He started to speak. His voice was quiet at first, almost a whisper. But he pushed forward. Martin Luther King Jr. was the leader who fought for equality. The words didn't come out perfectly. He stumbled over equality, mispronouncing it slightly. But instead of freezing up, he kept going. He remembered Lynn's advice, be louder, don't sound scared, and raised his voice a little. His classmates were quiet. No one laughed. No one snickered. They were listening. He could see their eyes on him. But there was no judgment there, just curiosity and interest. The longer he spoke, the more comfortable he became. The tension in his shoulders slowly began to loosen. With each word, each sentence, he felt the fear start to dissipate, replaced by something else, a sense of accomplishment, a growing confidence he hadn't expected. He finished his part, and for a brief moment, there was silence. The weight of the room seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy. Then, to his surprise, there was applause. Charlie froze for a moment, not sure if he had heard it correctly. But sure enough, his classmates were clapping, and Mrs. Thompson was smiling proudly at him. The relief that washed over him was overwhelming. He had done it. He had spoken in front of the class, in English, and made it through. A new beginning. After class, as students began to gather their things, Liam clapped Charlie on the back, a broad grin on his face. "Dude, you did great," he said, his voice full of enthusiasm. Emily smiled at him as well. "Yeah, I knew you could do it. You nailed it." Charlie felt something stir inside him, something warm and unexpected pride. It was small, but it was there. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done something he could be proud of. It wasn't perfect, and there were still mistakes in his speech. But he had tried. He had faced his fear. And he had succeeded. He knew he still had a long way to go. English wasn't going to suddenly become easy overnight. There would still be moments when he stumbled, when the words didn't come out right. But now, he understood something important. Mistakes didn't define him. What mattered was trying. What mattered was not giving up. From that day on, Charlie began speaking more. He still made mistakes, his accent, his pronunciation, his nervousness, but he didn't let those stop him. And little by little, English became less of a wall, and more of a bridge that helped him connect with others, step by step, word by word. The more he spoke, the more he realized that he didn't have to be perfect to be heard. He just had to try.
Love this content? Hit like and subscribe for more amazing English lessons.